right. So since we are a small crew in person, I'll introduce myself more formally for those watching on video land. So I'm Mel Hauser. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm executive director here at All Brains Belong, Vermont. And today we are going to be talking or introducing our whole June theme on niche construction, which is designing a life that works for your brain. So for those of you, there's a couple of you who are joining us live who are new to Brain Club. So just as by way of introduction, all types of participation are okay. So you can have your video off as they are, it can be on, off, whatever you want. Move around, leave, come back, fidget, have pets and kids and whatever climbing all over your head. And unmute, it's pretty casual, so just unmute and shout things out. You can type in the chat box. If you're using the digital hand waving thing, I may not see you in presenter mode. So if I'm not responding to you in a timely manner, just interrupt me. We at All Brains Belong, it's really important as to we are affirming all aspects of identity and that we're respecting and protecting everyone's sense of safety. So if anything comes up today that's any potentially distressing topics, we just make sure we give each other a heads up with a content warning. All right, if you'd like captioning and they're not popping up automatically, you likely have two options. So I don't know which one's at your screen, but there might be a live transcript, closed captioning button to click, and then you can choose from live transcript or show subtitles. Or if that doesn't pop up, click more with the ... and you'll probably see it there. All right, so by way of introduction, what are we talking about with brains? So we all have different ones. We all have different brains. Modern day neuroscience says that, the idea of there being one default brain is like not a thing. We all have different brains that exist on a continuum. There's an infinite number of ways in which we sense, process information, learn, think, communicate, and this all exists on a continuum. It's like biodiversity, neurodiversity. We all have unique patterns of strengths and challenges. All have things that come easier, things that are harder, which is why something called universal design, which is that you offer things to people with flexible, multimodal ways for engagement, because you never know how somebody's brain is going to do a thing. So you offer different strategies and give people freedom and choice to pick what works for them. But as we know, all too often, that is not the case. All too often in 2022, there are so many defaults in the healthcare system, defaults in education, defaults in all kinds of the major structures of our society, which is why lots of people are really stressed out at best, and at worst feel truly excluded and marginalized from all of the major structures of society. And so when we're talking about true inclusion on this continuum of moving from not just tolerance, not just acceptance, but belonging, where only individual people get to decide if they belong. That is what true inclusion is. And unfortunately, when things are designed with a default that is not a match for someone's brain, they are not going to feel like they belong. So what we're talking about here is that, here's Maslow's pyramid, if you will, like the basics, the hierarchical structure of human needs. Well, there's a lot of people whose needs are not met, like the basic needs are not met. But working up toward true, empowered, self-actualized people, that just seems like a pipe dream for a lot of people. And that is because a lot of us don't even understand our own brains. Then we have this environment that is set up with the defaults. We don't recognize that why it's hard to do the things is because it's not set up for us. And then no one talks about this. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So there's a great book, actually, I'll pull it up, The Power of Neurodiversity by Thomas Armstrong. And he introduces these 8 principles. And that's where I learned this term niche construction, which I had only learned like a few months ago. And one of my board members introduced it to me. And before we get into what that is, I'll share with you the other principles of neurodiversity. And as I mentioned, this continuum, but it's actually multiple continuums. So if all the different traits like sociability, flexibility, all of these in each of our brains exists on this continuum, and skills exist on a continuum too. And whether something is defined as that, like you are competent at something, is often defined by the values of the culture in which you're living. As opposed to like some, like absolute universal life truth. The mismatch between your needs and the environment is also culturally defined. And he includes principle number 5. I like kind of grimaced when I read it, even though like, yeah, well, anyway, we'll talk about how this plays out. But Armstrong writes that success in life is based on adapting one's brains to the needs of the environment. Yeah, I think that we see that, but it shouldn't be that way. If we truly had universal design, we wouldn't need that. But he does say that success also depends on modifying the environment to fit the needs of your unique brain. And that is what niche construction is. And that's what we're going to get into the nuances of. And Armstrong also shares that when you do that, when you achieve positive niche construction, you're actually more able to adapt to the environment because you're directly modifying the brain by actually having its needs met. And that's going to allow you to proceed up that pyramid towards self-actualization. What we don't want the square peg hammered into the round hole, because what you break the peg, and that's what happens to so many people. When we think about how 1 in 5 people have brains that think, learn, or communicate differently than the so-called typical brain, even though I'm not sure that is an actual thing, that there's like an actual typical brain, because this is all this big spectrum, this neurodiversity, like biodiversity, infinite combinations sort of picture. But if we think about the defaults that are based around the brain that society has deemed to be the right type of brain, 1 in 5 people have brains that work differently from that. That's a lot of people that are maybe being either formerly or presently hammered into fit into that mold. I also want to talk about, actually, we're going to come back to this. We'll come back to this. First, I just want to talk about getting to know our brains. So I think, and I made a little graphic, and I can email you guys the handouts of this. This is something I made for my patients to talk about this. So I have pictures for non-readers and words for text readers. But there's like 10, I think about, these are the 10 parameters that it can be helpful to kind of take stock of our own brains. How do we take in information? Oops, hold on. There we go. So we take in input from the environment. All of us, we do. There's the 5 senses that we learned about in school, but there's also senses that not all people know about. So there's proprioception. That's the feedback our brains get from our muscles, our bones, our ligaments. This is how much movement or how much pressure. There's interoception. So your brain interpreting internal body signals. How hot, how cold, hungry, thirsty. That's why there's lots of, and for all of these, we are, more or less sensitive to each of these sense parameters. Sometimes that's consistent, sometimes that changes based on context and changes over the course of our lives. But interoception examples, that would be like, there's lots of people who don't feel they're hungry until they're really, 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 really hungry. We call that hangry in my house. or people who don't feel thirsty until they're really, really, really thirsty, or until they're severely dehydrated and have headaches. Oh yeah, I guess I didn't drink literally all day. Yeah, that's me. Vestibular input, that's where your brain's detecting from the feedback from your inner ear of where you are in space, and that is a complicated sense that we could have a whole, we should probably have a whole brain club on it. And then ninth sense neuroception, that's our threat detection system. We are wired such to be, we're constantly monitoring the environment, safe or not safe. But there are some people who are more likely to for that alarm to go off of this is unsafe. And that could be for aspects in the environment, energy taking in, demands, internal and external demands that trigger that neuroceptive alarm. So what comes easily, what we have to work harder at, how we communicate, whether we communicate in long conversational turns or short conversational turns, whether we use our voice, our hands, communication device, whether we can look and listen at the same time or not. My 5-year-old will describe, I have the kind of brain that listens better when I look away. Yeah, you do you. The kinds of language or the kinds of words that we use. Play and interests, not just what we play and what we're interested in, but what we're not. Some of us have many interests, some of us have few interests. There are some brains that are what's called monotropic, which is that fewer things captivate our interest at a time and do so more intensely than other brains. Whether we do one thing at a time or many. Socializing, how much me time versus we time do we prefer and find comfortable? Whether it's easy or hard to join in on other people's play or conversation, or whether it's easy or hard to make friends, feel comfortable with friends. We differ in terms of what's stressful to us. This is a model from The Whole Brain Child by Dan Siegel and Tina Preen Brayson. Though I use it to describe these concepts to kids, I also use it in my presentations to adults because it's actually the way I think about it. I think about our cortex, our upstairs brain, that's we're doing our complex thinking, planning, decision-making. Downstairs brain's our limbic system. That's the part that keeps us alive, our fight, flight, freeze, these kind of automatic responses to our environment. And so we differ in terms of what's going to trigger downstairs brain and what it's going to look like when we get triggered. Fight, flight, freeze, but also perhaps it's flood, like flood of ideas, fawning, subconscious people pleasing as a safety mechanism, just like cognitive fatigue when we're dysregulated. So it's going to look different for all of us and different in different contexts. What we do to relax and cope, both healthy and unhealthy ways. How we express ourselves, whether that's like screaming, music, dance, art, just knowing about kind of what our default go-tos for self-expression are. How we think. Do we have a kind of brain that, on that balance of making plans to going with the flow, how much we want things done in a certain way, how we handle changes and interruptions to our plan, and executive functioning, those higher order cortex things. How does our brain plan, organize information, initiate tasks, overcome the resistance to non-preferred tasks? We all differ in our executive functioning. And lastly, how we learn. Is it in certain contexts or certain material that we learn best? This type of material visually versus auditorily versus hands-on. And we all do all of those things. We all have the abilities to learn in all of those ways, but there are for sure things that come easier to learn some material in some ways. And what are the supports that help us learn? So the thing about niche construction is step one is going through that stuff. And it's gonna take some time. Like step one, getting to know your brain. And then, and only then, thinking about your current situation. What's working well, what's not working. And then once you've done that, that assessment, what would work better. So what's the big picture of niche construction here? So, the first question is like, where do you spend your time? That might be, where if you work outside the home, what's that like? What is your time in your home like? If you're in school, what is that setting like? So where are you spending your time, and is that a fit for your brain? What do you spend your time doing? So if you, and anyway, we'll go through the specifics next, but just big pictures. Where do you spend your time? What do you spend your time doing? What makes it easier to do your thing? Is it assistive technology? Is it existing in a culture of interdependence where you are collaborating with other people, where you are not spending your brain power doing things that are exhausting and depleting, but that you've kind of navigated such that you are utilizing your strengths and you've made arrangements for other people to use their strengths, which complement yours. And then lastly, what gives you dopamine? So dopamine is the brain chemical that is often talked about in the context of reward, motivation, pleasure. But turns out there are lots of other things that dopamine does. And I often speak about, rather than neurotypical versus neurodivergent, I often talk about like the dopamine bound brain versus the not dopamine bound brain. Like there are brains, so you could just say, hey brain, go learn that thing, go do that thing, you need to do it for your future. And the brain's like, okay, I'll go learn that thing. I have no idea what that's like, because I have a dopamine bound brain. When you have a dopamine bound brain, you need dopamine. It's not optional. You need it for your motor functions. You need it to transition between tasks, between ideas even. You need it to operate your brake pedal, when to put the brakes on with a thought or an activity. And so when the dopamine bound brain does not have dopamine, we have inertia. Inertia feels terrible. And you can have the two flavors of inertia. There's a foot on the gas inertia. That's like an option. And, like inertia is like the physics concept of an object in motion stays in motion. The foot on the gas is, I start doing the thing and I can't stop doing the thing. And, that plays out in all kinds of ways. That is, they're people who are doing like some kind of repetitive body focused behavior, picking skin, plucking eyebrows. This is road rage, like can't stop doing the road, this is workaholism. This is substance struggles. This is the can't stop talking, even though you know that the conversation's not going in the way you intended to. This is foot on the gas. There's all kinds of things. And then, foot on the brake, foot stuck on the brake. That's, I can't get out of bed in the morning. I can't initiate that terrible task. But anyway, both versions of that are dopamine deficiency for the dopamine bound brain, and the management of them is dopamine. So let's get into the details. So these are some ideas of what we might think about in designing a life that works for you. So if you know what you're interested in, what gives you dopamine, you might like plan your whole life around that. Like, for example, let's say that your monotropic focus is brains and you want to think and talk about brains all day. Maybe you might quit your job and start a nonprofit where you talk about brains all day. Not that we know anybody like that. So attentional style. Do you have the kind of brain that is noticing small details, has like enhanced perception that you're noticing all these things, and maybe you have a job or something in your life that thrives on that, versus more of a holistic attention style. Stimulation, we differ in terms of like how much stimulation we need in a given moment. So if we're someone who needs a lot of stimulation, we might plan our day around that, as opposed to if you have the kind of brain that is more comfortable with less stimulation. Well, maybe you won't schedule like 10 back-to-back meetings. Change and sameness, and actually we had a group medical visit the other day where someone was talking about, I want change and sameness at the exact same time. Yes, that is common. So it's about kind of planning your life around meeting both of those needs on balance. Thinking about your environment, including, sensory processing issues in your environment. Like when I used to work in a hospital and I'm pretty sensitive to auditory input, it was a disaster. It was like chaos all the time. I didn't know anything about brains then, but it was like constant, like ah. So that's not an environment that works for me. That's the whole round peg and square peg and round hole thing. Cognitive strengths versus challenges. Like one of, I didn't know these things until fairly recently, but I have the kind of brain that it's really hard to look at something, keep it in my working memory, and transcribe it. Like it's like the hardest thing. And I have a lot of internalized ableism about that. We're gonna talk about that in a minute. But I've like planned my life around not doing that. And there's all kinds of workarounds when we talk about assistive technology soon, maybe in a couple minutes. I think it's a couple slides from now. How do you offload your brain so that the challenges are less challenging? And cognitive strengths. When you figure out what those are, you plan your life around that. Like I have the kind of brain that thinks in systems, where I can hear a thing or see a thing and zoom out and put it in the context of everything. And I gravitated toward a life where I get to do that all day. And so I really like teaching kids about that because there's a lot of people who share that strength, and kind of learning how to appreciate the strengths of your brain is a really important skill and something that some people come to intuitively, but some people do need some support around explicitly recognizing their strengths. Go ahead. I heard someone wanting to talk. Go for it. Maybe not. I can't tell. It looks like, Nita, were you talking?
I'm sorry, I was not trying to.
Oh, that's okay.
I can stop it now.
No, I couldn't. I couldn't. The first time I was like, oh, it's an accident, the dog. And then I was like, oh no, it looks intentional. I'll be patient. No problem. Anyway, so explicitly helping people identify their strengths and affirming those things is really important, because there's a lot of internalized ableism out there in the world, and it's very common that my patients and all kinds of other people in my life who will, my brain, like, I always do that. So this, it's really about really when we looked at that diagram in the beginning about, tolerating to acceptance to belonging, we have to do that process with ourselves a lot of the time. Movement, activity, how much of that we need. I have the kind of brain that I don't need as much movement, but so I can sit in this chair for all these hours, and that's okay for my brain. But there's lots of people for whom that is not true. My 5-year-old and I, we were with another little friend outside, and we were outside, and the child was self-regulating in beautiful ways outside, and I was like, whoa, I can imagine where there are some environments where this sweet little nervous system does not have the ability to meet their needs. Because this is all different for all of us. And there's lots of people who are in situations where they are not permitted to move the way that they need to move. And that is profoundly dysregulating to many people. So communicating, there's lots of people who it is, they're being, they're forced by the culture of their workplace to communicate in ways that really stresses them out. For those for whom auditory processing is challenging, like having a job where you're on the phone without visual feedback, without assistive technology can be really challenging. And really stressful, and really, like, you can do the thing, but at great cost to your brain because it's taken you so much more brain power, much battery power to get it done. We all have different access needs, but no one talks about it. And if we don't talk about it, then we feel like, oh, well, our needs are not important. Yeah, well, it would be really helpful if the Zoom meeting had captions, but it doesn't. And okay, I'm gonna suck it up and I can do it, but like so getting to be a place, and actually our community advisory board here at All Brains Belong, when we spoke recently about like what would it look like when we have a more neuro-inclusive community, and that was something that came up a lot, that there would be more obvious, overt, everyday conversations about access needs. And yes, I agree that needs to happen. Autonomy, having freedom and choice to designate the details of your work, your life, depending. I mean, everybody, I think that while many people value autonomy, there are some brains that truly need autonomy in order to feel safe in the world. And so putting yourself in situations where that's the case, and kind of recognizing when you don't have enough autonomy and what's that balance. With autonomy comes responsibility, and like how do you teach kids about that and have those conversations is important. And then the last parameter I wanted to make note of is just like independence versus interdependence. A lot of times when people use the word independence, they may be referring to autonomy. Sometimes they mean it, but that's just like, being aware of really independence. Like, I do it by myself, not like I chose to do it, but I did it and I didn't have any help to do it. And a lot of times, if we're really using that word in the way that and we're meaning it the way that we're using it, independence, a lot of that comes from like mythology, like the brain rules that we learned as children, that other people taught us, of like, well, be a big girl and do it yourself, like all this sort of language that kind of stays with you over the course of a lifetime. But really, interdependence, relying on other people, there's nothing wrong with that. So in a culture of interdependence, we all need each other, and we all have something to contribute, and we contribute for one another. And when you have autonomous partnerships, autonomous connections, interdependence. And anyway, so often, including with professionals working with kids, a lot of times people are talking about independence when really I'd like to see more discussions of autonomy with interdependence. Actually, before I keep going, I'd love to like pause and see if anyone has anything to say about this stuff. Is this stuff kind of resonating, or what's it been like so far? And feel free to unmute and shout it out or type in the chat box, whatever works for you.
I definitely relate to when talking about internalized ableism and the brain rules, being told that we should just be able to like push through or get over it when it's just how we are, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Amen. And it's interesting, like I'm ableism is actually, you know what I'm going to do? I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip a bunch of slides and just talk about ableism, so that we can all be on the same page about that. And there's a couple of comments in the chat. Resonating, eye-opening, helps me empathize more with friends and family. Dopamine-bound brain clicks for me, and second, the internalized ableism. Oh yeah. So and actually, I'll put a link in the chat at the end. Somebody remind me if I forget. We did a brain club a couple of months ago on shame and internalized ableism. We did like a whole brain club on it, and it was such a good conversation. All right, so let me share And I'm gonna just jump. Actually, I'll talk about this. We'll pick up from here. All right, so when we use the word disability, we should be thinking in the social model of disability, where it's not the issue where there's, all the problems are because there's something wrong with the person. Disability is not an absolute thing. So you can have impairments, things that are challenging, but disability is relative. So if I am a wheelchair user and I approach a building that has a ramp, I am going to have less disability than if I approach a building that does not have a ramp. The idea is that the more accessible the world, the less of a gap between what you are trying to do and what you're able to do. That being said, there is a lot of discrimination against people with disabilities because this is one of the only, this is like one of the isms that people out loud really believe that it would be better to be able to do the thing. So like when I think about like racism, genderism, ageism, like all the isms, though there's implicit bias for all of these things, when we think about disability, there's explicit bias. Just want to like throw that out there for a minute. Like people really say things all the time without any awareness of how biased this is. And I'm going to play a video. I think I'm going to play a video. What's happening?
So what is ableism? Ableism is part of a larger group of isms that includes racism, sexism, ageism, and so on. Ism beliefs often devalue certain groups or individuals based on characteristics they can't control. Ableism is a learned belief that people with typical abilities are superior to those with physical or cognitive disabilities. When we see ableism around us, it appears as a prejudice toward people with disabilities. It can be demonstrated consciously or unconsciously through words and actions. Language is one of the most powerful ways we connect with each other. Unfortunately, ableism shows up in our language all the time. You've probably heard of social media campaigns that ask people to stop using the R word. The R word, or retarded, was once a legitimate medical term to describe people with cognitive disabilities. But over time, people began using this word to describe all kinds of bad things. The result was that the R word became associated with being bad or wrong. Using the R word today is not only ableist, it's considered hate speech. Euphemisms are another way that ableism shows up in our language. A euphemism is a word or expression that is substituted for something else that is considered too harsh, blunt, or embarrassing. Imagine how you might feel if something about you was so bad or embarrassing that others felt ashamed to even talk about it. Common disability euphemisms include differently abled, handy-capable, mentally challenged, and special needs, just to name a few. Disability scholars and self-advocates label these terms as patronizing because they reinforce the belief that disability is an undesirable state. Instead of euphemisms, many self-advocates have voiced a preference for simply using the term disability or disabled. This term can be used with person-first language, for example, my sister is a person with a disability, or it can be used in identity-first language, as in, my sister is a disabled athlete. Keep in mind that person-first language and identity-first language are personal preferences. If you're not sure which one a person prefers, it's okay to ask.
So I wanted to throw this out there because I think that there is a lot of internalized ableism. So when I struggle with something, sometimes my first response is like, I should be able to do the thing. Once I started learning about my brain and started really trying to practice niche construction, I have been much more able to recognize when a challenge I'm experiencing is because the thing was designed in an inaccessible way. And I am much less likely to like get pissed off at myself and be unkind to myself. I wonder if anyone has anything to say about internalized ableism. Because it can be a process to unpack, and a process that takes years and years to unpack, because it's decades of a narrative that was discriminatory. A lot of times I have found myself becoming more comfortable calling out, I guess I'd call them, ableist microaggressions that are so beyond what people would intend. It's little things like, well, my partner should be able to book his appointment. Well, we're really talking about executive functioning differences here. And just bringing transparency into like, of course, it's been, decades and decades of this narrative, but like, just, that's not how it is. It's hard for lots of people to do lots of things. Doesn't mean that you're defective and deficient, or that the people in your life are defective and deficient. And this happens a lot with, let's say, like, big, strong emotional responses to stressors. And we see this in kids a lot too, kids and adults. When people have like big emotional responses, there are lots of judgment of this, because like, you're an adult, you shouldn't have meltdowns. Like, well, I did. So, and the shame that comes from knowing that you're being judged because someone does not understand your brain, knowing that you're being judged for violating your own standards of what a normal and healthy brain that you're continuing to learn and unpack. Complicated stuff. How's that sitting with everyone?
Another example that I thought of was just assuming like the worst, or assuming that like negatives would come up. Like the other day, my mother said that she thought that someone she was watching on YouTube was autistic. And I was like, oh, why? And she started listing all of these positive things. And I was almost surprised that she wasn't like anything about meltdowns or overwhelmed or anything. It was all of these positive qualities. And that sort of made me realize that I'm used to, anything diagnostic being a negative or deficit thing.
Yup. And in fact, as we know, the diagnostic criteria still used in 2022 are based on this outdated 1900s paradigm that is essentially autistic stress behaviors when profoundly dysregulated, which is why there are so many autistic people who go their whole lives without understanding their brains. But that's a really great story about your mom. Wow.
I'll be brave and talk out loud. It brought something up. So I've been recently reviewing am looking at paperwork because you have to prove everything always. And I was looking at paperwork from childhood, and the labels on things have the word deficit, 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 deficit. And I'm just sitting there like, okay. And now, some of that's changed to disorder, which apparently disorder is meant to sound better than deficit, but just some of that language and like what's implied by that language and how much I internalize those labels that then made me want to really, really hide all of those things, especially in professional environments, and then like overachieve so I could prove that I do not have this thing.
Absolutely. Last week we had a brain club on dyslexia through the lifespan, and we had there was some of the presenters on the panel were identified in childhood and some were not. And one of the patterns from the adults who had been identified in childhood is that because there was so much deficit-based language and so much stigma, they like a lot of them like literally hid how they processed language.
We just got it. I am dyslexic and it's cognitive processing deficit on everything, some other things going on, and hit it all the way through entire PhD program. It was really quite functional for me. And now trying to come away from that and get accommodations when I don't control the tech on my computer because it's my employer controlling things is just mildly triggering. And so I found this group. So here I am.
Welcome. And in fact, that we're going to talk about assistive technology next. So this is what ends up happening is that when people are able, they basically like, so I'm how old am I? I'm 38. I learned that I was dyslexic when I was 37. Made it like you, I made it to have a doctoral degree, and at great cost, right? Like you invent, like via niche construction, we did the thing we shouldn't have had to. That is no, but more people need to be talking about that. Like, so you, and a lot of times I'll go to my patients' IEP meetings, young kids, middle school, high school, and sometimes I hear ableist statements like, well, they're not going to have that accommodation in the real world. It's like, why not? They should. So anyway, there's so much in this world that needs to change. And I think it just starts with community conversations about, one in 5 people is dyslexic. This is common. This is super common.
I think all the things that are linked to it that I didn't realize. I was reading something last weekend, and for all of 2nd grade, they taped my hand to my pencil. They taped it because I can't hold a pencil. And so I've always been like, I hold it wrong. I hold a pencil wrong. And people are just like, you're crazy. I still hold it wrong, quote unquote wrong. And I found out that this was linked to, and I had no idea until this last weekend. So,
yep. Yeah, there's all the things that got like criticized and pathologized, and the people who did it probably didn't even understand why they were doing it. They were just following the brain rules, the generalized cultural brain rules about why you do it. You have to hold a pen this way. You have to hold a pencil this way. I remember like, people noticed how I held my pencil, but they didn't notice that I had headaches every day and neglected the entire left side of my paper and wrote on an angle because there's something, like the way I process things visually is different. And anyway, these are like all the things that I think I would have spotted in a person because I spot it now. But yeah, like turns out the way that we hold implements relates to core strength, which might be indicative of like hypermobility. It might be related to like the way I write with my shoulder. And now I have all the neck things that go along with being a person who writes with their shoulder instead of their fingers. But I don't think the people who were criticizing how I held my pen, I don't think they even knew that. It was just, hold the pen the right way. There's only one way to hold the pen. Or, but that's one thing. But the other thing would be like, why are we telling people that they like have to spell We have spell check. Why are we telling people that they like need to be able to perform these complex calculations? We have calculators. Like all of this is ableism that's just like accepted and taken for granted as what goes on. But as far as assistive technology, and just based on what you said, Amelia, about what's not happening in your workplace, there's high tech, fancy programs, low tech things like text to speech, or I don't know if anyone's experimented with like there's all kinds of Google Chrome extensions that will for dyslexia that convert color, convert size, gradation. There's all kinds of things. I'm happy to connect with anybody who wants any specific recommendations. The other thing I'll do is I'll just make a plug for the Vermont Assistive Technology Program. It is free to consult them. They are incredibly helpful. They've worked with me. They've worked with many of my patients. They're fantastic, and they just like help you solve your problems. They have a free lending library of things to try out and see if it works for you. And it's covering high tech, low tech, sensory modulation things. But are there like specific here? I'll stop sharing. Like, are there, Amelia, when you mentioned not having,
I will back. So my work has some, I think what it is we're getting there. I actually work on a team that's like gonna hopefully be doing some, we'll see how it goes. But it's more the technology request process to get the thing. So it's the burden of proof. And then also like we have these certain ones that we approve that we like because the powers that be in the tech office like them. And so you must like, so we have them, but you better like this one that we provide, if that makes sense. And I've always worked on my own computer and had my own ability to pick the ones that work for me. And now I'm being like, you must listen to like this specific thing, or like we give you text to speak and that's what's for you. And I'm like, that's not what's for me. And certain
that's not what's for me. Yeah.
So I think it's just the process itself and the self-advocacy that I have to go through to get the things that is, because it's a lot of having to explain over and over again and justify. And then it's very limited to like a form, and you better predict in advance exactly what your accommodation needs are across all of time, or you must redo the form.
And form that is so hard to read and write on.
And so it's not that I'm getting nothing. It's just some of it's just like the support and convincing myself to do it and to keep doing it and to keep fighting the battle and to not just retreat and be like, oh, well, I guess this works for other people, so this should work for me. And this is here, so I should just accept it. And then, yeah, I almost I think so often I've done the retreat thing that my natural state is, okay, I'll just go back to pretending this isn't an issue.
Well, you run out of spoons.
Yeah.
I mean, that would happen to anyone who's having to constantly self-advocate. And like many organizations, for all the attention, getting exhausted to the point where we decide that we are the problem. That's exactly right. Like, well, I wouldn't feel like I'm beating my head against the wall. It must be me. No, dude, it's not you. It's because people literally don't know that we all have different brains. Today I went to a school team meeting where someone needed an accommodation for a student needed an accommodation for a presentation they were giving. And they were told, oh, we have accommodations available. It's called, you can present to a teacher instead of presenting to the audience. I was like, just one? That's like, just, that's what you do. Yes, that's what we do. We have an accommodation in place. It's very similar to the story me. Like, no, that's not how that works. Anyway, this is what goes on. It's so many brain rules. Yeah. So on the flip side, there are there's organizations that I think are starting to get it, especially organizations that have been attending to diversity, equity, inclusion, but like not talking about neurodiversity and disability, particularly invisible disability. Anyway, so I've been pleasantly surprised at how many like and like across industries of people who have been reaching out and wanting some professional development and staff training around these topics. That's a thing we do here. Anyway, but people, like, by and large, like if you don't know, you don't know, you're never going to reach out for training.
I'm trying to embrace that it's going to improve model. And like, I know there's people that are focused on it and do care. It's just the exhausting nature of not having the things when you need them.
Well, I think I think that's a great segue to this. I'm going to go back to that slide of the big picture of niche construction. Hold on, I'll share again. So if the big picture things are not being met, then when we go back, like the what's working well, what's not working well, maybe there are some things that, like big things, that need to change. If there is a big structure of somebody's life, like where you work, that's depleting all of your bandwidth, like that's not sustainable. Just saying, like true niche construction would be such that you're not spending your whole day banging your head against the wall. It's very tempting to like suck it up and push through because it's always what you've done. But that's not niche construction. That is going to cause a, go back. Sorry. Yeah, that. Like you're not going to be able to reach the top of that pyramid to unlock your full potential as a human when your needs are not being met, with your physiological needs. Whoa, that's intense. But it's hard. It's so hard, and everything is a trade-off. I'm wondering, does anyone feel bold to say that, hey, yeah, I realize like one of my big picture needs is not being met, and there's something concrete that I think I might be looking to change or learn more about.
I think once I found that, so once I started learning about my brain, a lot of my big needs weren't being met just because I didn't know what they were. And a lot of it was processing time. Because a lot of the time, if someone says something to you and you don't answer, they assume that there's like resistance or anything like that. So just understanding the need for processing time has been absolutely huge.
That's amazing. And now that you know about that, you potentially are in a place when it's safe to advocate for yourself. Like, hey, I need a minute to think about it, or longer. Yeah.
You're all on the beginning of my journey of self-advocacy. So
It is a journey. It is a journey. And I think like connecting with, as you've done, connecting with people who get it is, I think, the first step to recognizing it's not you, it's the environment. Well, thank you all so much for coming. And this conversation will continue next week, where we'll be talking about specifically once you figure out your access needs, how do you communicate about that? And we're going to have some panelists sharing some strategies that they found helpful. And I'll look forward to seeing you then. Oh, you're so welcome. That's great. Yay. I'm glad you finally were able to make it live. Welcome to the ABB village. You're welcome. All right, see ya. Bye.